afternoon, everybody. For those of you that I don't know, my name is Denison, and I am chairing the Children and Childhood History Network. It is a small but mighty network, and we welcome many people. So if you're interested, please come and let me know. I'd be happy to incorporate you into our program and activities. And then I'd like to welcome you to what I've long been thinking about as this kind of like before spring break treat. Now, an early spring break treat where I've been looking forward to coming, sitting, leaning back, just listening and learning, and I'm really looking forward to and thinking of that as a great treat. It's also a treat and a real pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Miranda Sachs, that many of you have already met, I believe. Miranda is a modern European historian specializing in the history of France. She got her PhD from Yale in 2018, and she then spent a year teaching at the College of William and Mary, excuse me. She's now in the first year of a 3-year appointment as a visiting assistant professor at Denison University, just down the road from us, which is one of the many reasons why we were able to lure her in to come and give a talk on her work. In addition to her classes at Denison, Miranda is working on her first book entitled Paris Children. Paris's Children?
It's changing name, but...
Okay, Paris's Children, Work, Family, and Welfare in Third Republic France. In the book, Miranda promises to investigate the lives of French working class children and the ways in which ideas about childhood and work changed in the late 19th and early 20th century, and I can't wait to read it, so please, hurry. So anyway, Miranda's lecture today is drawn from that project. She's going to be speaking about the limits of childhood immigration in Third Republic Paris, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Brigitte, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming out on what I know is like the inches before spring break part of the semester. And as Brigitte said, in many ways this is a part of my project. Some of these sources I've been working with since I first started researching my dissertation, but in revising the book manuscript, the story has sort of come out of it, and I'm hoping to develop perhaps an article out of it. So this is the first trial run of these ideas, and I'll welcome your feedback. So although my project is about the 19th century, I want to start with something a little more recent. And in 2004, the French government passed a law banning students from wearing any conspicuous religious symbols in public schools. And although the language of this ban seems deliberately very neutral, it didn't surprise most people at the time, and I imagine most of you in the audience, recognized that this law had a specific target, and that was the foulard, the headscarf that a lot of Muslim girls wear. And this is one of these girls who in 1989 is banned from a school for wearing this, and so this becomes a part of the rhetoric in the 90s. And so by the early 2000s, the right of Muslim girls to wear the foulard, the headscarf, to school had become an explosive issue in French politics. You have politicians on both the left and the right supporting this ban as a way to enforce the separation of church and state, which for them is a cornerstone, or what they argue is a cornerstone of French Republican identity. The school is seen as a state space, as a secular space, and so these girls wearing a headscarf, so the argument goes, are practicing some kind of religious observance in this space. But embedded in the support of the headscarf ban is a larger critique of France's growing Muslim community. And what the ban suggests is if Muslims were not going to assimilate in the way that French politicians think that one should behave, that they're going to make this happen. The French legislators are going to legislate some kind of assimilation. So as a historian of childhood, these debates are all the more striking because of their focus on children, right? The ban applied to public schools, and so their focus is mostly girls. It's not about adults as much. And it asserted the French Republican state as the final authority over how these girls would attend school and the way that they would appear when they attend school, thereby limiting the autonomy of the girls and their parents over these kinds of decisions. And so the debate, and as a result, the ban then focused debates about assimilation on childhood, implying that parents who were failing to send their children to school in a certain way were thereby failing to assimilate to some kind of French ideal. So the debates over the headscarf are only some of the more recent chapters in France's long and fraught history of immigration. Within Europe, France has one of the longest histories of immigration, and it has an equally long history of and tradition of resistance to immigration, and to put it more bluntly, perhaps a much longer xenophobic tradition. And so in our current historical moment, when issues of immigration and citizenship and assimilation are so present in political debates in the US, but also in Europe, French history is instructive for the way that it can tell us about some of these dynamics and how they've changed over time. And so, as I said, as I've been preparing my book manuscript for publication, I've been struck by the story in my own sources and the parallels to some of these present-day debates about immigration and assimilation. So my work, as Brigida said, explores the experience of working-class childhood in late 19th and early 20th century France, which is a moment when the French government expanded its role in the lives of children. And I look at the way in which ordinary people started to conceive or continued to conceive of childhood against this backdrop of the government, the Third Republic's greater role in childhood. And so as a result, one of the things that I particularly look at is violations of child labor laws. These violations of child labor laws wind up being a way of looking at the friction between the government and the way that ordinary people are thinking about childhood. So it's something I can interrogate and start to develop. And so as it turns out, immigrant children were involved in a proportionally higher number of violations of child labor laws. And when they encountered these children, Republican officials in the late 19th century and legislators expressed a very similar anxiety about these children to their 21st century counterparts, the way that people today in France are talking about Muslim children. So these officials, through their regulation of childhood, through their efforts to carve out childhood as a distinct stage of life, were trying to create a more uniform experience of childhood. They were starting to recognize that children were developing beings, that they needed certain conditions, and they're starting to place various kinds of limits on what children could and couldn't do. And when children were working underage, or begging, or sleeping, in cramped quarters, these immigrant children were not experiencing this version of childhood. They were experiencing something different. And so for these French officials, these children's failure to access this French version of childhood spoke to their community's larger inability to assimilate to French ideals, to French standards, to French social mores. But in reality, the relative frequency of immigrant children violating the child labor laws was a result of a more complicated dynamic of exclusion. And so while immigrant parents were very often responsible for placing their children in situations that violated laws, French employers and French local officials were very often also involved in these violations. They very often enabled these placements. And so through their collaboration, these employers or these officials demonstrated that they envisioned a hierarchy within working class childhood. So even as they increasingly accepted that they had to observe the child labor laws when it came to working class French-born children, they saw immigrant children as somehow different, and that the laws didn't apply to them in the same way. That their childhood was somehow different. And we have to recognize that even if immigrant parents didn't see their own children as second-class citizens, we also have to consider the situation from their own perspective. Right? Many of their immigrant parents did indeed try to follow the laws, but France's labor laws were increasingly more and more detailed over the final decades of the 19th century, and in many cases were on the books long before the laws in many other countries in Europe where these immigrants were coming from. So what that meant is that these laws were structuring childhood in a way that they were unfamiliar with, that they hadn't encountered. And so for many immigrant parents, child labor was a natural part of childhood. So what we see then is that when Republican officials were endeavoring to standardize childhood, these repeated exclusion of immigrant children from the laws demonstrates the limits of Republican officials' ability to create a more universal experience of childhood. It shows us the limits of childhood. But what I'm going to argue in this talk is that the failure of assimilation was a two-way street, in that both French-born and immigrants alike treated immigrant children as beyond the applicability of these labor laws. So that we're seeing this double standard emerging, both from the perspective of immigrant families and from a number of French-born employers and officials. So in the remainder of this talk, I'll provide a little bit of context on this particular period in history, particularly in terms of childhood and immigration. And then I'm going to look at instances of violations of these child labor laws to demonstrate the complicated dynamic that led to immigrant children being excluded from their protections. So the period my research focuses on is Third Republic France. And I know most people here know what that means, but I just want to clarify that this is a government that lasts in France from 1870 to 1940. And it's replete with many contradictions in its ideology and in its practice. So in many ways, it claimed to fulfill the promises of the French Revolution, which we can see through a lot of its iconography. It very much celebrates its lineage from the French Revolution. At the time, within Europe, it was one of the rare governments that didn't have a monarch and that it had universal manhood suffrage. But at the same time, it had many contradictions. In this sort of promise of equality, it never gave women to vote, the right to vote, and was responsible for the expansion of France's overseas empire. And these are, some of only the most explicit examples. The Republic's approach to working class childhood embodies this tension between the rhetoric of equality and the sort of limits in practice. So, partly out of concerns for its declining birth rate, France was one of the first industrialized countries to have a decline in the birth rate starting in the 19th century. And partly out of this ideal of republicanism and a commitment to its citizens, the Republic enacted a series of policies meant to protect working class children. In addition to establishing universal primary education, the Republic passed child labor laws, created juvenile courts, and expanded the welfare system to the young destitute. And so these policies carved out childhood as a distinct stage of life, and they set clear barriers around childhood. They set clear milestones at which children could be of an age to work or could be of an age to go to school. So ultimately, all these policies are aimed at, as I said earlier, recognizing that children were developing beings and trying to encode the stage of childhood. But as I argue in my book manuscript, these efforts to standardize children, while in many ways, protecting them, also encoded working class childhood as a distinct stage within childhood. That working class children were, as a result of these policies, sort of funneled into a track to adulthood that led to life as a productive worker. So we see that, something that's meant to create a more universal experience of childhood claims to ultimately perpetuate a class system. And so here's another example of this contradictions in Republican ideology and iconography and then practice. And so the Republicans' treatment of immigrants and foreigners similarly captures this tension. In the 1870s and 1880s, immigrants constituted about 3% of the total French population and about 7 to 8% of the workforce, and this is even greater in the city of Paris. As I said, France was one of the first industrialized nations to experience a decline in the birth rate, and this is in a context where a lot of the rest of the Europe is still booming. So France winds up being a place that a lot of immigrants come to in the late 19th century. In the decades before World War I, the largest group of immigrants in France are Belgians and Italians, who are France's neighbors. And if you look at the maps, the largest concentrations of immigrants tend to be in the northern regions of France, which is on the Belgian border, and then on the southern regions, which border Italy, and then of course Paris, as well as the other hotspot. And then in the 1890s and early 20th century, as the pogroms are happening in Central and Eastern Europe, you have a wave of Jewish immigrants coming west. So these are sort of the largest groups of immigrants within France in this period. And as a result of this rising number of immigrants, in 1889, the Republic changes its citizenship law, and it allows that children born to immigrants who are born in France and reach the age of majority in France are allowed to become French citizens. They can elect to become French citizens. And so this is part of the way that the Republic is constructing citizenship and national identity. We see that it's based on birth and based on political participation and not so much based on an ethnic ideal, right? As we know, there are limitations to this, but this is how the Republic is trying to construct citizenship, at least in the metropole. And so this influx of immigrants does fuel a political backlash, most notoriously right with the Dreyfus Affair, where the Jewish army officer is tried for treason and is sent off to Devil's Island even though he's innocent, and this fuels tensions between his supporters and his detractors, and what that ultimately results in is a rising swell of xenophobia that then leads to another version of French nationalism, which is exclusionary and racialized. So we have these two versions existing simultaneously in this period. Now, what my talk is about is not so much the high politics and the political rhetoric, but it's important to keep in mind that this is all happening in the context that I'm going to talk about. What I'm interested in is how the sort of exclusionary ideals are happening at the level of factories within Paris and at the level of sort of local administrators who are trying to negotiate that. So, as I will show, within a category as seemingly universal as childhood, we still see that foreign children are being treated as a separate category in this period when we see this rise in xenophobia. So let me now turn to these laws and sort of outline what the laws are and then explain the different forces that lead immigrant children to be excluded from their provisions. So the principal child labor laws in France are passed in 1874 and 1892, and they set specific conditions around the employment of young people in industry. And so most notably, they set a minimum age of employment at first 12 and then 13. They mandate that children need a day off of work a week. They say that children can't work at night. So they're sort of trying to define what it means to be a child worker. The laws also stipulated that children needed a livret, which was a work permit, and this will come up time and time again with the immigrant children, so I wanted to clarify that. And then also employers have to keep records of the children they had who are working for them. And then the other thing the laws did is they set out provisions for their enforcement. So they created a corps of labor inspectors whose job it was to go out and observe whether or not these laws were actually being enforced. And the labor inspectors had to draw up a yearly report of the success and failures of these laws. And so this yearly report is one of the principal sources that I'm going to be drawing on today. So in these yearly reports, they often note their violations. So in the descriptions of the violations of their laws, as they draw these up each year, immigrant children, even if they were a relatively small fraction of the workforce, appear in a striking number of these yearly reports. They're disproportionately represented. Right? Remember, as we said, maybe 7 to 8 total nationally, probably a little more in Paris. They're showing up every year in particular periods. And this is particularly true in the first decade of the 20th century, where the chief labor inspector for the city of Paris has been pretty much every year problems involving immigrant children. And these tend to be either underage Italians working in the glassworks or Eastern Europeans working in unsanitary conditions, particularly in the garment industry. And so reading the circumstances around these violations, we can get a more complete understanding of how they wound up in these situations. Before I do provide these examples, I do want to emphasize that the majority of my sources were produced by labor inspectors. Right? So that's a particular point of view. These are people who attached a lot of value to child labor laws, who viewed these child labor laws as rights and as true. And so they were much more likely to view people who violated child labor laws as unscrupulous or ignorant. These are also men who considered that they were acting in the best interest of these children, that anybody who wasn't observing the child labor laws was not. And so they often cast their efforts to root out violations as better or admirable than parents who, if you start to think about it, may have been trying to maintain their households in a foreign society, right? So they may not have that level of appreciation that we as historians can provide. So we need to keep that in mind as we're reading these sources. So as I argued earlier, children were often caught between their parents, employers, and local officials. And so I'm going to talk about the ways in which these 3 different constituencies influence the experience of children before considering the case of Italian children working in glassworks, in which we have an example where all 3 of these different groups are working together to contribute to children being excluded from the workforce. Excluded from the child labor laws. So in the first place, and here we have an example of this, Many immigrant parents were unfamiliar with the specific prescriptions of the child labor laws. So here we have a letter from 1912 of a father named Bernard Nasky, who's a recent immigrant from Eastern Europe, and he writes to the Minister of Labor to ask about the laws. He has a son who's 17 years old. He's trained this boy to be a metal worker, and he can't find a place for the boy. He's unable to find someone who will take this boy in. And so he wonders if the French bar children under 18 from working. As we know, right, the minimum age of employment is not 18, it's 13. But crucially, he observed that all the French, he uses this word, must be aware of the labor laws. There's some knowledge that the French have that he doesn't have. He's trying to figure this out. And in reality, the situation was a little more complicated. After 1900, any employer who has children and adults working simultaneously has to keep the hours that the children are working. So if children are only allowed to work 10 hours, the adults can only work 10 hours. If the children aren't there, the adults can work 12 hours. So a lot of employers are refusing to hire children. And so this is why he's not able to place his son. So a representative of the minister suggests, you know what if we place the boy outside of the center of production? He can still work in this factory, he can sort metal, and that way the adults can work their full day, but he's not, and he can have a job and he's not integrated. And so Nasky's letter presents us a rare case of an immigrant parent, actually. This is his voice in the archives. And in the letter we see that he clearly understands that the French are conceiving of childhood in a different way than he does, but he's having a hard time understanding what this looks like. He doesn't quite understand what is French childhood. There's something different in the way that the French are doing. Nasky's confusion is certainly understandable. Even if employers were supposed to be posting the child labor laws on the walls, you have these massive posters that show up in the archives, by this point these laws were pretty long and complicated. And moreover, they required a level of knowledge of legalese that might not have been accessible to someone who's a recent immigrant, right? These French might not have been that good. And I should point out, too, that a lot of French parents were also chafing at these restrictions. You know, they didn't even see childhood in the way that the Republic was envisioning. So even within this sort of French version of childhood, there's a much more bureaucratic version that even these working class parents are having trouble accepting. And for them, childhood is also progressing much more gradually. It's something that doesn't have the strict borders that the government is increasingly placing on it. And so for them, they should be the ones who should place their children, just like Nasky, who's trying to take this kind of authority to place their son. Certainly some immigrant parents did use this ignorance to their advantage. So one labor inspector in 1909 wrote that tracking down immigrant children in the workforce required, quote, an extraordinary patience and tenacity. What they found is that a lot of immigrant children had false pieces of identity, these livrets. They marked the wrong ages, they would get them falsified, and so that made it very hard for the inspectors to detect violations. If they go in and they check the livret, and all the children are the right age, it's hard to prove that they're underage. However, a lot of these inspectors, because their job is literally to go around and look at children working, they usually have a sense when a child is underage. And the parents did not help. Like once the inspectors go and talk to the parents, they find that many of the parents pretended not to understand French, or at least they're claiming that the parents pretended not to understand French. And the way I read this actually though, is that by seeming to remain ignorant of French, the parents then don't have this knowledge, right? So they have a conception of childhood that exists in their own language in the way that they're going to describe it. As soon as they have access to French, they have to accept this other version. So they're using their ignorance, deliberate ignorance, as a strategy to prioritize their own version of childhood. And as I said before, right, working class parents also did similar things. It wasn't simply immigrant parents who were trying to find strategies to avoid the laws. Working class parents would lie as well. But here we see that immigrant parents are using their specific outsider status actually as a tool to allow their children to enter the workforce early. And we also have to keep in mind that they may have chosen to place their children prematurely out of an economic necessity, right? You know, as an immigrant family, they may have needed that money. But we also can read in this that their deliberate ignorance also suggests that they did not think that the French laws were applicable to them. that, they're choosing to remain outside of the French laws, but they're also observing these laws as something that doesn't apply to their community. And the other piece of that is that they're removing children from French schools prematurely. If you put children in the workforce, they're leaving school. So they're also choosing not to have their children educated in this French education system as long as possible, but instead putting them to work. So even if this unfamiliarity could be a tool, it could also be a liability. Employers, both French and foreign, took advantage of immigrant parents' lack of understanding to then employ these children in less advantageous situations. So in 1904, 2 Parisian inspectors wrote about encountering enterprises run by foreign-born employers that sort of operated as a mix between an orphanage and a sweatshop. The first inspector described a Hungarian cabinet maker who had 18 Hungarian children working for him. The children had no other connections in Paris, and so the employer had them working day and night. And the inspector cited this employer for overwork. In another instance, an inspector found a Turkish printer running what essentially was an orphanage with children from Armenia, Bulgaria, and Greece. And these 2 examples show us just how diverse the immigrant population in Paris was. This is from all over Eastern Europe. And so few of these children in this print shop had pieces of identification, but the inspector did eventually ascertain that they were above 13. Again, this sort of intuitive sense the inspectors have. And so in this case, the employer, the worst thing he was doing was just failing to keep records. He wasn't breaking any other laws. But in both instances, we see how foreigners working in France who might have more financial stability, who might have more knowledge about the system, are manipulating this system to employ foreign-born children. And clearly, they're seeing these children as outside of French laws. That, they're in many ways making this choice, but by employing foreign children and not French children, they're creating an alternate system. And that's, reinforced by the fact that they're not creating records. And this approach was not unique to foreign employers. French employers, even though they were clearly aware of the laws, right, because they were using them when it came to their own French-born children, also used this sort of supposed ignorance of immigrant children to employ these children in less advantageous situations. So in 1876, Labor Inspector Maurice, he's the chief labor inspector for the city of Paris, brought a process against a rope maker by the name of Eugène Crone, who had a factory in the Paris suburbs. And in this instance, he cited Crone for employing 10 children who did not have adequate instruction. So these children were 15, but they were illiterate. So that was another limitation. You can't have children who are illiterate working for you. And also Crone was not keeping appropriate records. So again, this sort of failure to record these foreign-born children. None of these children also have a livret. So they don't have a work permit, and they're not in his register of employees. In his testimony to the police commissioner, Crone used the children's foreign origins as a defense. As he put it, quote, "I hope the difficulty we experience in recruiting children for our work and simultaneously fulfilling the prescriptions of the law is taken into consideration. They are all foreign children who are almost impossible to force to go to school." So in his explanation of the situation, he's making it sound like the child labor laws place an undue burden on him. And so in this context, he needs to go out and find children who will work for him, and who can he find but these immigrant children? And given that they are immigrant children, he doesn't have the same responsibility to treat them well. This is his justification. But he also implied that their failure to attend school was not his fault, right? He couldn't help the fact that these immigrants wouldn't attend school, and so he was just taking advantage of this situation. And then by framing it this way, he also, I don't know, I sort of assume that he's taking into consideration that he thinks the police will read it the same way, that he feels like the police will be sympathetic to him and will view the immigrant children in a similar way. And so Crone was clearly setting a different standard for foreign children, and by failing to keep these records, he's keeping them outside of the system. But ultimately, he's placing the blame squarely at their feet. This is his defense, is that ultimately, even if he's treating them differently, and that's the way that one should treat immigrants. It's the immigrants themselves who are failing to actually observe the laws. And so he received a fine. It was only 11 francs, which at the time was about the wage of a skilled worker for 2 days. So it's, a lot if you were a skilled worker, perhaps less if you're a factory owner. So it seems like it's a little more of a slap on the wrist. So the most frequent instance, something happened to the paper. The most frequent instance of foreign children employed in illegal conditions were Italian children and the glassworks at Pantin. So Pantin is the suburb all the way up here in Paris, at the northeastern end of the city. And so they actually have a police officer. And so the circumstances that allowed for these frequent violations give us a more comprehensive perspective on the way that foreign children were treated as this distinct category of worker. And in the instances where the labor inspectors caught foreign children, they found that state actors, employers, and parents were all collaborating to exclude these children from the provisions of the labor laws. So the illegal transport of Italian children to France to work in glassworks started in the 1890s, and it was it started in the south of France. They put children in these factories. In the Paris region, this issue became more acute in the first decade of the 20th century. So here we have a sense of what the glassworks actually looked like. In 1901, labor inspector Droncourt started to suspect that something was amiss in his observations of a glassworks. In his inspection, he encountered Italian children with livrets, again these work permits, and they said that they were 13, but he had an intuition that the children were definitely not 13. And so with the help of the police, he was able to conduct an investigation and figure out what was going on. And they found that a number of individuals were collaborating to make this happen. And so in their initial investigation, the police discovered that 2 Italian parents had found ways to subvert the system. I'm about to butcher their Italian names, but in their initial investigation, they found a father named Galicchio who had managed to obtain an illegal livret from the mairie in the suburb of Saint-Denis. So Saint-Denis is the next suburb over in the north, and the mairie is the local city hall, and so that's where he would have needed to go to get a work permit. And so he had somehow managed to get an employee there to give him an illegal livret. Another mother, Elia Raphael, had used the livret of a dead child for her remaining child. So she took the dead child's livret and gave it to one of her other children. The police conducted an additional inspection in the factory and found 4 more livrets, one of which was forged. And this forged livret did not have the stamp from the mairie. They hadn't gone to the city hall, but it had the signature of the owner of the factory, Bernard Hoch, which suggests that he too was complicit in this whole endeavor. So although the number of individuals involved in this particular instance is slightly overwhelming, it captures just how many people were involved in getting these children into the workforce. It wasn't simply that Italian parents were trying to place their underage children. We also see that the director of the factory was willing to take underage children in as his employees. And his signature on that document suggests that he wasn't just accepting them in, but he was actually involved in allowing these children to work underage, especially when the official channels fail. And moreover, we see that the officials in the office of the mairie, whose job it was to enforce the laws, are even willing to break the laws when it comes to foreign-born children. So why? The cynical answer, of course, is money, right? For parents, sending children to work early provided much-needed money. If you send a child to work at 12 rather than having them work, you get a little extra income. And also for the factory owner, there is a financial benefit. So the job that these children were doing was taking the glass from a glass blower and putting it into a furnace. So it's something you do not need to be skilled to do. It's not a good job. You could get burned. There's very little opportunity for advancement. So by this period, even French-born children are not doing this job. People don't want it. It's something the factory owners don't want to pay someone a lot of money to do, but they're having a hard time finding someone who will accept the pittance that they're willing to pay for this job. So for them, there's an advantage to having these Italian children, more particularly because the Italian parents are willing to take less money, given that these children might not find a place anywhere else. Right? In order to even get them a place, it's pretty hard. And we have to imagine, too, that the corrupt employee at the mairie got some kind of bribe as well. So everybody got some money. But it was not simply money. as with Crone, we see that all these individuals either chose or failed to see the child labor laws as applicable to Italian children. And so all these different sets of interests converged in creating a double standard for Italian children in the workforce. The initial investigation into this particular factory did not stop the flow of underage children working in the glassworks. The labor inspectors were unable to transform the way that this network of individuals conceived of childhood. They can enforce the law, but they can't change the way that people are thinking. And they found, too, that they were fighting a much larger network. So many of the Italian children were smuggled into France by a padrone, these individuals who would go into Italy and recruit children, and a padrone would falsify documents, and they would smuggle them across the border. As the French got smarter, so too did the padrone. The padrone would steal livres, or they'd switch the names of children. So they'd find ways to subvert the ways that the inspectors were catching these children. In 1909, for example, the inspectors found 3 children working at night, and these children were between the ages of 10 and 12. And the reason why they're working at night is they thought the inspectors were more likely to show up then. So the owners are finding all these different ways to get the children into the factories to do this work. So as much as the inspectors sought to impose this new idea of protected childhood, they continued to find children being treated as commerce, right? These children are just being smuggled across the border like some kind of an illicit manuscript. They're not being treated as a protected kind of childhood. So what led parents to agree to this illicit commerce? And the labor inspectors' reports conflict as to whether the parents were blissfully ignorant about what was happening, or if they were deliberately complicit in these activities. And the relative lateness of Italian child labor legislation as compared to the French child labor legislation actually provides us with some clues. It's interesting. So Italian labor law banned children in wandering professions from 1873. But it was only in 1892, as these scandals in France were taking place, that the Italian labor law banned children under 12 from working. Up to this point, it was only 9, except it allowed children between the ages of 10 and 12 to work. So even in the early 20th century, Italian labor law is letting younger children enter the workforce. And it's only in 1907 that Italian labor law bans children under 12 from working. So that means that for Italian families, until the mid-aughts, it was legal for younger children to work. And not only was it legal, it was normal. It was a normal part of their life. Moreover, unlike the French, who were worrying about this declining birth rate, the population in Italy was growing, so that meant there was a larger number of workers. And so what we see here is that Italian parents are applying their own conception of child labor law, even as their own government and the French government is creating a different version. And that what they do, once their own government starts to enforce a different version of child labor law, they then have their children work in France, where they know that they can find employers or officials who are complicit who will allow them to continue employing their children. So it's interesting that as they're finding their own government cracking down, they're trying to look for alternatives, and they look to France. And the case of the glassworks is all the more intriguing because it gives us a chance to see how something as universal as childhood is being defined differently on either side of the border. Right? The French are thinking of childhood as this universal stage, and yet on the other side of the border, Italians are thinking of it in a different way. And so the result is this conflicting experience of childhood. And I want to emphasize that I'm not attributing blame solely to Italians. I'm not trying to suggest that Italians are somehow backward, that Italian parents are somehow remiss, or that Italians are late in enacting child labor law, because the Italian parents would not have been able to employ their children in France if they had not found French employers who were willing to collaborate with them. And these French employers have been following these laws for their French-born employees for at least 4 decades by this point. So, so the factory owners do not have the same excuse that they're engaging with a different idea of childhood. So ultimately, what the French have to do for French authorities who actually want to enforce these laws is they have to find a solution with the Italian government. And in 1910, the two governments signed an accord which protected French workers in Italy and Italian workers in France, so that they're sort of mutually beneficial, and it also mandated that Italian children had to receive a livre, a work permit, from the Italian consulate if they worked in France. So they needed the Italians to verify it. And both governments agreed to have children stop working at the glassworks. So they agreed that this is not a good kind of employment. So what this law does is it sets a common standard, right? The common standard for childhood, for child employment that crosses borders, that was creating a wider idea of childhood. And so these laws eliminated a hierarchy within childhood and created a version of childhood that was not dependent on nationality. But then, of course, the labor inspectors start finding Spanish children. So there's only so much you can do. So nonetheless, the challenges of enforcing child labor legislation in the glassworks demonstrates the forces that were combining to determine that foreign workers would have a different experience in the workforce. Even if the work inspectors did genuinely want to enforce these laws legally, employers often treated their foreign-born workers as distinct and beyond the purview of French child labor legislation. Likewise, even some French officials share this view. We see this, that even the officials are treating them as different. And so as a result, foreign parents who may not have shared the French conception of defining childhood were able to ignore the child labor laws within France and had more ability to do so than French-born parents, who maybe, in many cases, would have been quite happy to do this. As for the children themselves, unfortunately, we have very little information about how they felt and whether they too were keen to enter the workforce. Aside from the inspector's observations of their tiny physiques and sad appearances, the children themselves are rarely in the archives, and this reinforces their inability to express themselves within this French system. So in conclusion, the challenges that the French Third Republic faced in regulating the work of immigrant children demonstrates the limitations of French Republican citizenship, beyond sort of what my initial project was about, which is about the working classes. The Republic's child labor laws carved out childhood as a protected stage of life, and it does so in terms that seem broadly universal and very neutral. And yet, if we study the frequent instances where child labor inspectors encountered foreign children working in dangerous conditions, we find that these laws had less ability to regulate the conditions of these young workers. It was not simply a failure of immigrant communities to accept French norms, but a failure of French employers and officials to treat immigrant children as similar to their own workers. To curb the exploitation of foreign workers, the French had to change the way that all these actors conceived of immigrant children. They couldn't just legislate the problem away. They actually had to change the way that people perceive childhood and sort of get people to get all these different individuals to understand the borders that they were erecting around childhood. And to get all these different individuals to understand that childhood was, in fact, a universal stage of life. And so to take this sort of vignette back, or this research back to the present, having volunteered in an after-school program that's actually right here, so not very far from Pointon, where the glassworks were, with children who were first-generation immigrants, this sort of need to not just legislate equality, but actually change the way that people think of childhood and expand the mental horizon to recognize that children are universal, is something that I have recognized and think that the French probably still need to work on. So this research, and not Americans as well, not exclusive to the French. So this research, shows us in many ways, the parallels between the present and also perhaps some ways that the past in treatment of children in the past has some interesting repercussions.
Will you take questions, please? Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very interesting. You suggested that it's especially because of the low birth rate that France was one of the first European nations to pass child labor laws. Are there, was it purely self-interest in then, or maybe are there other factors contributing to France being one of the first to pass these laws? Or is it exclusively or mostly the low birth rate, do you think?
It's not exclusively. So it's something that picks up in the 1860s. There are child labor laws in the 1840s, and Britain has them at the same time. But it's a certain group of elites within France who are social Catholics who have a certain sense of responsibility to the working classes, and that drives the initial push. With the second set of child labor laws, it's also a way to sort of enforce the barrier between school and work, and that's important because these people are not social Catholics but radical Republicans. who are enforcing education.
Were British child labor laws, were they, a lot of them earlier, or this about the same time, or?
It's about the same time, I think. Yeah, I
About
think
the
the
same
first
time
one's
as
the
the
Factory
French.
Act is, I think, also in the 1820s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you very much. It was just so interesting, and now I really can't wait for your book. I just have a question about the children. Am I right in thinking that most of the kids that you find in these records, the labor inspectors' records, are boys?
Yes, and that's
That would
important.
not be surprising given where they're inspecting work sites are places where likely boys work. So I'm just wondering though, is this really a story about boyhood, and what was the story about girls parallel to this?
Okay, so I have a whole chapter on girls, and that's part of the issue, is that so much of the literature on child labor in France treats the child as like the gender neutral category, because l'enfant is one of the few terms that is gender neutral. But a lot of industrial work does involve boys. So for girls, there's very much a blurring between the home and the workspace, and that defines what they can do, right? They're most, like, I think 3/4 of girls, or women in France, are in textile or garments. They are training for work. They're very much training for motherhood at the same time that they're training for work, because these skills go back and forth. And also, they're actually more likely to be victims of violations. So like immigrant children, there's a double standard that operates because the home is so prevalent that, you know, if you're having them work in situations that they're sewing, but they're not with their mother, but they're with another woman, that's when the line gets a little bit blurry. And it's only in the first decade of the 20th century that the labor inspectors really start to crack down on that. So for a long time, there is a sense that the laws aren't as important for girls. Maybe not as important, but that those spaces cannot be regulated. And the final thing is that they're more likely to be employed by religious orders. That's the article I have that came out this year is all about, or is coming out this year, is about the role of religious orders in employing young women, and how at the same time that the Republic is cracking down on the immigrants, and the same time they're cracking down on home industry, they're also cracking down on religious orders in this effort to have greater visibility. So girls are in many ways, at the same time that they're trying to track down the immigrants, they're also expanding their view to try to bring girls into the system.
So just a really quick follow-up question, it's just really very specific. I don't know if you know that. What's the charge of those local factory inspectors? Like, what were they charged with? Which sites were they supposed to investigate?
Industrial work. And
with a minimum number of workers, or what constitutes that?
It's pretty small workspaces. I think it's in the text. If you have a sewing machine, you know, at a certain point they can. So they are eventually getting into female workspaces, because there are spaces where girls are just sewing and they're enforcing
Exactly.
this. Yeah, so that does, if it's being sold for a profit, and then it also expands to étalage, stalls, market stalls. That's the early 20th century, but it's sort of a slow process of adding different kinds of work.
I really enjoyed this. The only question I had was, were the labor laws universal in the sense that, was it 10 hours per, like, any amount of work? So like glass work versus like more of a low stress, or like maybe less dangerous job? Was it just a blanket 10-hour term?
Yeah. So initially it's 12 and then it's 10.
Right.
The one thing that does define between different kinds of work is that the amount of load you can carry. They limit different children of different ages can carry different loads. But yeah, they're not saying that, you know, sewing is less onerous than this work, and so you should work less. The only other distinction that's made between workplaces are ones that are dangerous. So certain spaces are dangerous for different ages. And it's usually because of powders, poussière, or chemicals.
Yeah, and thank you for a really interesting talk. I'm wondering how the children's presence in the labour force is shaping kind of larger ways in which French citizenry is being imagined. Like, if we think of children as often kind of seen as sort of the symbol of the future, right?
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether the kind of context of the low birth rate is potentially kind of, and the needs of the labour force are potentially dampening some of the anti-immigrant sentiment that we might expect there to be, or I'm just kind of, if you could speak about how is a kind of a broader, how is a broader community envisioning sort of the future of French citizenry as a result of these children being in these labour positions and these kind of ways of immigration.
So you mean how are the immigrant children being conceived of?
Mm-hmm.
So the violence against immigrants starts to go up, and like in the 1880s, because there's depression. So even if there's a decline in the birth rate, there's also depression. So there's that tension.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that happens is that there's anger about immigrants because they are perceived as being willing to accept lower wages. Particularly in the garment industry, where there's a lot of Jews in Paris, there's a lot of anger about these workers who are driving down the prices. So any sources that I see about immigrants, and again, right, this is, there are probably people who are fine with it, and they don't show up in the archives.
Right.
But there's nobody who's vastly positive. It's either negative or not there, right? And so there's sort of frustration about people driving down the prices.
Go ahead.
No, I was.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was looking back to the kind of way you started out with framing this topic in the Third Republic, both in the contradictions within the promises of equality in a really radical and sweeping sense, right? But also the limits that we see of that in practice. I was curious, you also mentioned at that moment too, kind of the ways in which the revolution and the First Republic are in people's minds, or perhaps like in the rhetoric and imagery of the Third Republic. I was curious if you see in the ways in which childhood is kind of also invoking an earlier framework. If there's ways in which childhood has links to these earlier Republican moments or not.
That's hard. So it's from a true 18th century story. I mean, in the educational space, right? Like, all their books are about it. It's very much part of that tradition. I don't know how much the children are being schooled in the direct connection to the revolution. I think somebody has written about Bastille Day, and that's why I really like this image, République, which probably anybody who's been to Paris has seen, is that the images around the base are images of the revolution, and the final one is people in the Third Republic celebrating the revolution, and I think, or celebrating Bastille Day. And I think that's part of it. It's sort of like the pageantry, but at the same time, the focus has changed in the Third Republic, right? The sort of like anti-German sentiment is building, this like level of militarism. So I think it's infused with all of that, and I do think it's in the education. But I don't know if it's quite as present in the labor laws, or you have the Industrial Revolution between the two.
I was curious. There's so much of the work in the 18th century that is concerned with how do we equip future citizens.
Right, okay.
Is anyone worrying about that for these children, or is it just that they're literate?
It's
able to work?
Yeah. The fairy laws are all about like a civic education. So that's like
for these children as well.
in their school books. I mean, to the extent that in a 100% class, when everybody going nuts, you can learn it. But I think it's present. There is very much like the schooling for people and
Can you talk a little bit about maybe the connection between the Les Lois Ferry in 81 and 82 and child labor laws? Did you talk about that much in your book at all? Or,
Okay, so child labor laws, the first one is in 1874, just the social Catholics, and they don't do adult education because they don't want to limit the role of Catholics in education, right? And then they passed the fairy laws, which set 13 as the age of entry into the workforce. But 12 is the age, here's what's confusing. They said 12 is the age of entry into the workforce in 74. 13 is the age in which you have to stay in school. What do you do about children between the ages of 12 and 13? And that's what creates this ambiguity. In 1892, they say you have to have a work permit and you have to have graduated a certain level. But throughout this period, there's sort of this tension between is it 12 or is it 13? And increasingly, you also, in order to enter the workforce, you need to have or certificat des études primaires, which is something that comes out of that. So there is a growing kind of relationship, particularly also between the work inspectors and the school inspectors, right? They're both going around and tracking down children. So there is a relationship. And there's a sense that one of the child labor laws are outlining what a child should be like, what a child should be like, and education is one of those pieces, and that's sort of built in with this very law.
So I really liked the part of the talk that was about the parents.
Yeah.
I thought that was just really interesting. But it made me think about how much parenting is a privilege and how only some people get to have that right to parent or be allowed to parent. And we also know that both historically and presently that immigrant parents are often deprived of the right to parent. So I was wondering, are there times when these children, immigrant children, are removed from their parents because they violate laws repeatedly, and what happens in those cases?
Okay, so the other piece of this is beggars, which that was something, if I had more time, I would have talked about. That immigrant children are more likely to show up in the imagery of beggars, not necessarily in the reality of beggars, but in the imagery, right? Oh my God, these kids, they're on the streets, right? Which is, again, something that's present in France today. But I do have a case where a Jewish mother has a huge family. It's either 6 or 8 children, and there are 3 kids who are apprehended for begging. And it's because of repeated instances where they sent these children out that they are taken away and they're put in a Jewish orphanage. So they're actually not taken into the French system, which is interesting, and why I feel like I have not found that many Jewish or Italian children being arrested, because they're not put into like the traditionally French system. They're put into charities, but not the ones that the French kids are being put in. Yeah. All right, well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It was neat.